On this episode of the Musicbed Podcast, we sit down with film producer and festival programmer Drea Clark. She's programmed for festivals such as Slamdance, LA Film Fest, Bentonville, and Sundance.
Certainly, I feel passionately about the films that I program, but I'm also more interested, rather than like, oh, this is the most competently made film or it's the most audience friendly, I would rather find something that is flawed but like promises massive talent.
This podcast is a production of Musicbed, the standard in music licensing for film, TV, and advertising. To create your free account today, go to musicbed.com.
We're sitting here today with Drea Clark. Drea, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I do want to get sort of a background of sort of who you are, but first I just want to say I feel like I know you really well already because I feel like I've gotten so many rejection emails from your time at Sundance.
It wasn't me.
But tell us a little bit about what you do, where you come from, and what you're currently doing.
I come from White Bear Lake, Minnesota. Go Bears. My background is slightly unique for filmmaking because I'm kind of split between festival production and festival programming. So I sort of started them concurrently when I moved here after graduating from the University of Wisconsin. Go Badgers. I started interning at Slamdance Film Festival and then literally stayed there for 19 years, working my way up. And I ended up running feature programming there for 13 years and was festival director for a couple of years. And then I moved to Sundance 6 or 7 years ago. This is all impossible because I'm like 26 years old, but yeah. I started very young. Moved to Sundance. And then I was also a senior program at LA Film Fest. I was there for like 11 years until we closed. And I'm currently at Sundance and I run programming for Gina Davis's Bentonville Film Festival, which has probably not rejected your work because you're not our target filmmaker.
Sure.
But, and then along with all of that, I started in production and music video. And so I worked the production side of it, coordinator, all of those things, and then ended up running the music video nonprofit, the MVPA, for years. And then just got into feature indie producing about 7 or 8 years ago. And every filmmaker that I've worked with as a producer is a filmmaker whose work I either programmed at a festival or discovered through a festival. So they blend in interesting ways, but not a lot of programmers do both to that extent. I've also been rejected by the Sundance Film Festival, so we share that.
That's good,
yeah.
Good. Do you still work with Sundance?
I do.
Cool.
I do, yeah.
So, I mean, that was just like last week, right?
Yeah. I didn't
there?
go. I haven't gone. I'm a COVID adverse kind of gal, so I haven't gone. Well, it hasn't existed again until this year. So I did some online Q&A intro things because we did have a virtual component.
So you have been rejected, but I do imagine that there's some conflict of interest there.
I've not submitted anything to Sundance since I've worked there.
Okay.
I was rejected prior to my employment. Yeah.
That's funny.
It's a good point.
Now that we've clarified that. Yeah. I do want to, I mean, what was this year like? Do you have any interesting stories of the films that you saw or things that happened this year?
Well, the section that I'm most involved with at Sundance is indie episodics and then our premieres. And indie episodics is great. That's actually why I moved over to Sundance, is when they started doing those. And so we've had sort of recognizable documentaries, like we showed Genius, the Kanye West, and We Need to Talk About Cosby was a big title last year, and Wu-Tang Clan. Like we've had a lot of sort of great non-scripted episodics. And then we had a great title called Work in Progress that Lana Wachowski ended up buying, and then it ended up selling to Showtime. So the idea was there's more and more filmmakers making either pilots or work in the episodic space. And we've been trying to build that as a marketplace in the same way that films are. So this year was the first year where all of the titles that we had in indie episodics were genuinely independently made, and none of them were bought yet by the time they got to the festival. Like there's other, like I mentioned, like Cosby, I think had already sold to Showtime, but the titles we had this year are all like on the table and ready to go. And they're by like, one of them's by Xavier Dolan, who's one of my favorite filmmakers. He's from Quebec. He did like Mommy and he's fantastic.
Mommy's so good.
It's so good. And so like watching a filmmaker that I love, that I think is like this baby sort of queer auteur, get into the indie episodic space, and like you get more time to stretch your wings, right? There's plenty of filmmakers that you're like, every film you make needs to lose 12 to 10 minutes or 12 to 15 minutes.
Sure.
But some of them you're like, oh, it'd be so great if they could expand this world. And that's what episodic storytelling does. So that was a very cool trend at Sundance this year of, there's people making really great stuff, both here and internationally in the episodic space.
So you brought up Genius. Genius. I don't know how it would be pronounced, but
something
the
like
Kanye
that.
West doc. I've always wanted to ask this in regards to premieres, but also just like the independent spirit of Sundance versus sort of films that would be considered more mainstream because of the talent that are in them, or like, how do you guys, because I think from an outsider's perspective, there's a lot of films there that you're like, yeah, I'm sure if my film had, this A-tier talent, or it had, you know what I'm saying? Like there would
100%.
be, so I wonder from the inside, like, how do you guys manage that, and how do you balance things? And
I think one thing that would be really eye-opening that people will never get the opportunity to know is there are an enormous amount of titles that have equally big or bigger names that do not get programmed. And I think if people understood the full breadth of what people are making in the indie sphere, that certainly it looks like, and we do have a lot of titles that have recognizable names. You're like, what a great, shiny, interesting new performance from, X. But if it was just that, it would be even more. We could have even more titles that were just celebrity, but with a festival like Sundance, there's only a handful that are true discovery festivals where you have enough credibility that you can program unknowns, that people are going to trust the programmer rather than I need to recognize someone before I want to buy a ticket. And a discovery festival, you can do that, but it's also a marketplace festival, so you're kind of balancing those two, ruling, and they can be in opposition at times. But because we do have our different sections, like Next will typically have, it's a whole section for first or second time filmmakers, think people doing more experimental work or interesting or narrative twerks or whatever, like narrative twerks. That's what we call it in the industry, not quirks, we twerk. But, to have those, and then that's why, again, like the premiere section is, these are things that are sold, these are things that are going to be cultural impact, because that's also part of what we're doing is establishing a tone of like, this is what we see in American cinema, especially there's a beautiful world cinema programming. But yeah, I don't think it's necessary for it. And I also, when I'm talking to filmmakers, because of course, like every filmmaker, I have 15 jobs. And one of my other jobs is I'm producer in residence for Film Independent. So I get to meet with a lot of filmmakers at different stages when they're just getting started. And that is a question that comes up all the time of, do I need to have name talent to either get into a festival or to sell? And certainly it helps more with sales than with festivals.
For sure.
But you're never, it's the level that you're going to get, especially at a low budget of like, unless you're best friends with, Ryan Gosling and he'll do it for scale, like that's the level talent that really helps. Like you're better off having mostly unknowns, maybe one person in there in a smaller role so that a future distributor can be like, great, people will recognize that person if they're at least part of it.
Right.
But you're so much better off having like good performances because, again, for the discovery side, a festival is looking for, this is a career we can say we helped launch. This is our filmmaker, and that's going to be someone who can get like really interesting performances, not, we got the guy who's like the boyfriend on a big teen show or whatever.
Yeah.
This podcast is a production of Musicbed, the standard in music licensing for film, TV, and advertising. From indie artists on the rise to leading composers, Musicbed has curated the best roster of musicians for your films. Go to musicbed.com and use the promo code Drea Clark to get your first month free on a standard subscription.
Is there any kind of stories that you might have from over the years of something that took you by surprise, whether it was a film or how it was received or anything like that?
I think, well, one of my very first memories of there are very few things that Slamdance truly lost to Sundance, but we showed the short for Napoleon Dynamite at Slamdance, and then they made the feature in the year between. And so we had looked at it, and then when I looked at it, because I was still at Slamdance, I was like, yeah, we're gonna lose this. This is gonna go to Sundance. But that one, I felt so strongly was like, oh, this is gonna speak to the festival programmers, right? Yeah. This, because comedies are really hard to program. A drama, you can get everyone on board in terms of this is a great performance and whatever. A comedy, if the comedy doesn't land and hit someone's own sensibility, then they can just say oh, the humor fails. It's just much harder to program in general. Napoleon Dynamite, I was like, no, programmers are going to love this. It's so unique, so whatever. But the audience reaction to it was actually really encouraging because it is so its own thing. It's such a distinctive film and so weird. And I really thought it was just going to be a fun niche thing that me and the other indie film dorks would be like, did you guys ever see this? Yeah, that played at the Hamptons or whatever. But no, it was the fact that it was a cultural moment. Yeah. That was a big surprise.
Why do you think you see so many shorts that get into Sundance come into features? Why is that?
Well, I think a lot of people either make a short as a sort of almost proof of concept. And when they do that, I always encourage, you're better off making a short than an actual proof of concept. A short has a beginning, a middle, and end. It's finite entity. You can have it programmed and have its own world. But it also, if you're making a short that either is a piece of a feature or is giving you the same tonal or character beats as your hopeful feature, then you have a direct record both of your ability to capture that kind of performance, to set that sort of tone, to give the mood, to give whatever. But you can also, the other thing that's so key, and it's just part of the programming and production process, is festivals are vetting, right? Everybody wants something that someone else has given a thumbs up to. Nobody wants to be the first thumbs up, and programmers have to be the first thumbs up. So shorts that have gone through that, and you're able to say, well, I made this short, here you can see my skills and what I can bring to the table, but also it played this festival and this festival, it won this jury prize, this audience liked it, because those are all things when you're looking for investors and collaborators. Everybody just wants, at every stage, how vetted are you? How vetted is your work? That kind of thing.
I was thinking of the Damien Chazelle's short for Whiplash was such a good example of that, where it was sort of plucked out of the movie. Yeah. But it was also, like you said, had a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Sure, yeah. He could have just done that as a scene, right? This is my proof of concept. You can see how I can build this musical moment, the physicality of the drumming and all of that. But to make it a short so it can have a life of its own. Yeah. Yeah, it's such a different thing. And it's also, even though most people working in indie film or financing, you read a ton of scripts, you look at a ton of lookbooks, but it's really hard to know exactly what's in a director's head. And especially if it's a little unique, if it's a little you're gonna have to trust me that what seems like the cerebral internal process of someone having an emotional response to drumming or being taught, you're yeah, that sounds so engrossing. Yeah. Sign me up for that cinematic journey. But then seeing it and you're like, oh yeah, it's visceral. There's energy to it. It's that's a great example.
Yeah. So I heard at some point, maybe it's the last couple of years, that do you guys still have around 9,000 films sort of? Is it more?
It's way more. Well, yeah. And those, I will say, because that's both shorts and features. Sure. Shorts is probably around 9,000. Then there's probably 2,000 or 3,000 features.
It's hard to believe that many things are getting made in the U.S. I mean,
it's not just the U.S. It's also international.
Yeah, I mean, because as filmmakers and
Oh,
I mean, you know this, like you kind of feel like you're on an island sometimes. Like there's not a lot of communicating to, there's not like a filmmaker's social media other than like your own personal like Instagram echo chamber, you know?
yeah.
So it's the numbers are staggering. Like where does in the process do you even begin to get through that?
So generally, like for Sundance and many of the bigger festivals, like LA Film Fest was also structured this way because we would have thousands of submissions. You typically have a mixture of what we call blind submissions, which are the bulk of them, which are the ones that come in, they don't know anyone, they've just submitted. And those are honestly the ones that I get psyched to troll through because those are like, oh, that's my personal discovery. I found that. So like one of the indies that's the indie episodics this year, I was like, oh, I found that. Chauncey, that's my film. Like it's so good and it's me and I should get all the credit for it. But that's not actually how it works.
Yeah.
It is a team thing. But so for the blind submissions, you typically have in-house screeners that watch those. We like to have 2 people see everything because everyone's taste is different. And if it's something like, I don't like horror, like those are, you're not going to assign them to them. And then as things sort of aggregate higher and higher scores, they move up to like the associate programmers and programmers. And then the other side of it is for like people like myself who are year-round programmers, if it's at different festivals or just at one place, we have tracking lists. So I'm tracking things all year. I track things as they're announced in the trades. I'll go through your Indiegogo and Kickstarters as those things. I'm like, oh, this is interesting, especially since so much of what we're doing, particularly at the festivals I'm at, both at Bentonville and at Sundance, is a mission statement to finding either underrepresented voices or unique perspectives, or so people who are making things in the Midwest and seem self-taught. I'm like, looks insane. These people are like throwing themselves down like chasms or something to get a shot. And there's like a skateboarder 2000s mentality, whatever it is. Like those are things. So they'll just go on my tracking list and I'll keep an eye out for them throughout the year. And then if they submit, I'll pull those and get an eye on them. So it's a mixture of things. And that's why too, that I think that there's a kind of mercenary side angle of like sales reps or people who go after filmmakers and are like, oh, if you pay me $5,000, I can make sure someone sees your film, which is sort of disingenuous because any festival worth its salt, like someone will see your film.
Those things exist?
The people that, yeah. And part of it is some of them do. Like there's plenty of sales reps who are great, who are authentic. They get in touch with me and the stuff they recommend to me, I'm like, oh, good. You have a good caliber or you know what I respond to or whatever. So I will put that on my tracking list. But I think filmmakers are often served just as well if you're like, do you know an alumni filmmaker who can put in a good word with you? Like the whole idea is just, are you making the best effort to do whatever you can to give someone in that, another person in that sphere, a ping just to get eyes on it. They may or may not respond to it, but no one can guarantee that. Like not even there's plenty of studio things we don't show. There's plenty of bigger name pitches that don't make it past the muster of the team or of like Kim Utani and the director of programming. And so it's not a for sure, like if you know someone you know. And I'd also add for Sundance that people may not be aware of this, but we have a real separation of church and state when it comes to the labs and programming because they do so much beautiful work year-round of finding filmmakers and refining the projects they're working on. And some of them help with funding and they don't put a word in and it doesn't say, like, we don't note when we're programming, like, oh, well, this came through Catalyst or they were part of the director's lab. Like, you can be cognizant of those things, but it doesn't give you like a leg up.
Right. I wonder if you could decipher what the, what is the psychology of the Laurel?
Ooh, the psychology of the Laurel. Well, it
sounds like a weird children's book or something.
No, it's great. I would read that. It would be like an Irish animated. Yeah. I think it's all back to that same thing of vetting of, oh, okay, I'm looking at something. So even your tertiary public that's like 8 steps removed will look at something like that and be like, oh, I have no idea if the Ann Arbor Film Festival is any good. It is. But this thing played at like 18 Laurels, so it might be worth me seeing. And if you think, us getting that many thousands of shorts and features and whatever else to like the rest of the public, especially if it's a self-release stage or a short, like people aren't seeking out a ton of those anyway, but if it's recommended somewhere and it has the splash of the Laurels on it, it gives that like, oh, this has come through. It's been tested in the fire and it made it through.
I hope this doesn't sound the wrong way, but it doesn't matter.
No.
Do you feel like those are always the best films that get into the festivals?
Well, best film is I'm actually glad you phrased it that way, because especially in like LA Film Fest, which I was much more in the like smaller group and overseeing all the features and everything with our team. That was one where the critique of like, we would spend months and months programming and crafting this lineup. And then the first people who had access to see it was the rest of the staff. And then I would get to hear exciting grumblings of like, competition's not great. And you're like, okay, what we aren't always looking for at a Discovery or Market Festival isn't like, oh, is this the easiest watch? Is this the most enjoyable? Like, oh, every part of this, like I would every day, rather than like, oh, these are the best films that we saw. Certainly, I feel passionately about the films that I program, but I'm also more interested rather than like, oh, this is the most competently made film or it's the most audience friendly. I would rather find something that is flawed, but like promises massive talent. Like, oh, there's such a great perspective here.
Do you have an example for that?
Well, no, because I don't want to call anybody's films flawed after the point.
But I agree with. I think some of my favorite films are like, are whether it's the visual quality of it or some kind of weird writing to it, but it has the spirit to it. Those are my favorite movies.
Okay, so like Ain't Them Bodies Saints, which is David Lowery's.
Yeah.
So that's a film that like anyone who looks at it and they're like, well, no, I kind of wanted it to be more of a thriller, or it harkens back to these very 70s films, but then it doesn't fulfill in the same way. But for me, that film is it's consistent and it's its own thing. There's like Ben Foster, it's one of my favorite performances of his. Like there's something really unique to it. Yeah. So a film like that, I mean, I'd much rather push for than, oh yeah, there's this great super generic film that's like a by the book.
Right.
And there's certainly like Strawberry Mansion by Tucker Audley, which just was at last year's festival. Weird ass. Like not everyone's going to respond to that, but Tucker does such interesting work, and he is the only one that can make those films, and that's something you want to celebrate at a festival.
When I think of Sundance, and not even just Sundance, but just festivals in general, like those are the movies that I feel like I want to see win, Yeah. Like A Killing of Two Lovers or something.
Yeah.
Like,
oh, my friend never made that.
Made for Nothing.
Yeah.
Just like, and such a simple movie, but like incredibly powerful. And the platform of Sundance and you know what I mean? Like, I feel
absolutely.
Like sometimes when I see, and I wonder if you have an opinion on this, but if a festival kind of becomes more commercialized in a way, does it begin to lose some of the, that sort of beginning impetus that maybe it started with?
Oh, I mean, well, Sundance is, it's literally become an institution. Right. So it's such a unique, there's nothing else that has really dug out the cultural imprint that it has and grown to the extent it has. Like it started so small and so genuine, but it also it feeds into a much bigger ecosystem of independent film and what is celebrated, what is shown to people, what has like the chance and potential of getting out in the world. And so there's a sort of burden on the festival for that. Like they have to satisfy everything from a general audience, an industry audience, a press and critical audience, the commercial reactions after the fact. So there's so many things being navigated. I'll say the thing that I can speak for, both for there and then that I also find true. So I oversee nominations for the Independent Spirit Awards, and those are all determined by secret committees. And it's a very similar process to programming because it's all of these people watching films, arguing them out, and determining the nominees based on that, similar to programming slate. And both the Spirit Awards and Sundance, which have both also grown in big way, like have to serve like, oh, if they either have a distributor their own or whatever. But there's such genuine intent by the people who do it. So like the programmers at Sundance, they care a lot. Like it's not, you're not talking at any given moment of, well, this one would be, this will sell quicker or whatever. Like those may be factors in, but you don't even get your film on the discussion table unless someone has responded to it artistically. And then you can factor in the other things. And that's why I say, like, when I brought up before with, especially with LA Film Fest of, oh, these aren't the best films. And you're like, well, right. But like, we have a competition slate of 10 to 15 films. We're also looking at, do I have a range of films in that? Am I like, there's a million filters that go into every decision-making process, which I also think is good for filmmakers to keep in mind, because it means if your film didn't get there, it really just might be there was one other film very similar to yours that had a slight leg up in some way. It was either a first-time filmmaker or from a part of the country we haven't seen before or whatever. So there's an arbitrary quality to it. I've sort of derailed here, but it really does come back to that same thing of you're serving so many different gods when you're programming. And so even a festival like Sundance, which has become this like revered institution and kind of necessary step, like so many people build their production schedule and their post-production schedule around when do I get my submission in, and that they're always actively trying to fulfill all of those things. Like adding the next section in the last 10 years or whatever was to directly address, you know, well, more and more people who are making indies have more and more access to big stars than they used to. And how do we keep supporting and finding these smaller works? Oh, we're going to build a whole other section to do that. And the same thing like with indie episodics, which has been in the more recent years. So I think that there's good faith attempts to try and balance all of those things.
There's a lot of filmmakers that would probably assume that people in your position, not you specifically, but all the programmers, all the curators, are kind of like gatekeepers in a way, you know. And I wonder, do you get bombarded by filmmakers? Like, do you like that? Do you anticipate that growing in some way? You know,
it's absolutely gatekeeping. I mean, I think that's part of the responsibility you sign up for, is acknowledging that like you're literally keeping a gate, because there's thousands of films that you are not letting onto your thing, but onto your festival. How I always try and reconcile that is I'm trying to think of how many people can we help, which filmmakers can we help launch, who can we, give a leg up for their work and an audience for what they're doing. And there is absolutely, especially because, I live in Los Angeles, there's a couple of filmmakers here. And also I've been doing this for so long. So like I've had to personally reject so many people that I am friends with. And to try and explain,
included,
like you, like so many times, I'm like, Christian, sorry again, guy. But the idea of that I think that most filmmakers, especially the ones are like respectful of, they understand it's a group thing. It's not personally me, like, no, you're out.
Yeah.
And also if I can explain the reasoning, I will. But again, the reasoning is often so nebulous, and it's things that they won't know about. Of like, oh, well, there were actually 3 other films that were also sort of preteen coming of age stories. Yeah. And this is like, some of that is soothing. Some of it is like, but why wasn't mine the best? And you're like, because it's a subjective art form.
Yeah, right.
And so I thankfully don't feel like I like campaigned or anything. Maybe if I had more power at Sundance, I would. Yeah. But I know especially like I said, to keep going back, but to LA Film Fest or to Bentonville, where I do, and I'm more of a key voice there is a different element of like hey, checking in or whatever. But because I'm also a filmmaker, I get it. It's your baby. You're trying to do the best thing you can for your kid.
And you have to probably compartmentalize, sort of, for sure. I do want to, I'd love to ask you, what is probably the biggest thing, but also the most frequent thing that you see in films in the craft element that you're like, it just didn't make it?
There's bad sound kills me. I mean, I know everyone says that, and I'm literally hearing impaired. So I don't mean that like, oh, I can't hear it, but like, I'm not a great hearer. I'm not someone who like, oh, the score resonated. I'm like, there was a score. Like, I'm not that person, but bad sound immediately makes you seem like bargain basement. Like, oh, I shot this on my phone.
So funny
in
you
our
say
backyard.
That. I went to it was a friend of mine's like pilot. They made a TV show. They did a premiere and everything. Beautiful story, beautifully shot. And as soon as it comes on, and the audio is just, it's not even that it was bad. It's just not subpar. You're just out of it. You just almost don't care. Because you can make
a lot of artistic excuse or like reasoning for why something looks lo-fi. Like, oh, we want this to feel very immediate. You want to feel like you're in there with them, like they did shoot. But the sound, as soon as you hear it, you're like, oh, home video.
Yeah.
And so there's that. There's also, and again, from a filmmaker, I'm sensitive to this, but for indies, you have limited budget, which means you have limited time, which means so many people just shoot for coverage. And and I've been guilty of this. Like, I have, like, the first film I produced, I'm like, I would give an eye to go back and have more B-roll and inserts alone, like, let alone different performance takes. But you shoot for coverage of like, I have this much amount of time per day, and that comes across in your film, because then you're no longer crafting a whole film, you are serving a script.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Lose a lot of the tone. Yeah.
Yeah. And so the filmmakers, that's why when you see things and you're like, oh my God, like After Sun, which is one of my favorite films of this year. There's a film that lives up to all of its hype and then some.
Yeah.
And it's a directorial debut, and it is filmmaking at every level. It's a simplistic story. It is a small story, and yet every single department is necessary and explored. Like how it's every framing, every single camera. Like, so those are the difference of, oh, did I shoot this scene for coverage? Yeah, they said every line, but did I take extra time in preparation to think about, like, there's a small delivery in that where the daughter is like laying across a bed upside, like on her back, and she's staring at her dad. And when you cut to the dad, you're looking at him upside down, and it makes all the sense in the world. And if you don't think all of those things through in your prep, then you're not exhibiting like, oh, I'm a filmmaker. My format has multiple departments of artistic range that I could be flexing. But I'd add to that as much as, putting the time and effort in every department, again, and it's a prep thing. Like, I taught music video production at USC for like 13 years and was always like, number one thing, put more work into the free stuff you can do. Like, refine your script as much as possible, work with every department head. But there's so many films that are like, oh, we only have this amount of days, that they don't think about like small things like color stories. Like, is your character, what do we see on their person that changes? Like, every department should be crafted in that way.
I'd love to just dive in a little bit into what does it actually look like to, what is the process of curating your section of festivals? Like, actually, like, are you sitting at your house just all day long for 12 hours watching films? Like, what does it actually look like?
I had a conversation with my civilian friends, as I call non-filmmakers, but my friends this year, just recently, where they were like, oh, what's your top 10? And I'm like, well, I have multiple top 10. I know what's top 10. So I sent like my favorite 60 movies or whatever in different, like, here's international, here's documentary. And then was like, yeah, well, I watched over 330 films. And if you think of that for like a regular human with an actual job, that's a lot. That's but I'm like, well, my job during the day is to watch things. So for me, in terms of shaping a slate, it is that balance of one. I have plenty of times I've had dream slates before things have come in that I'm like, oh, this sounds really promising, or like, oh, this is an actress who's like, this is the first thing she's directing. This is going to be perfect, and then I'll get it and be like, it's not quite there. And so you're readjusting all the time. Almost all programming is done as a group, so you're also responding to like how the other people on your programming team felt about a film. So like there's things that I'm like, it's a slam dunk. What are you talking about?
Right.
Like, we need this. This is a key cornerstone of the competition lineup. And that other people would be like, nah, I thought it was derivative. And you're like, what? So there's a lot of arguments that go into it, respectful arguments.
What do those arguments sound like in terms of like
they can get really pinched because you, at a certain point, especially for the shaping of it, like a lot of festivals, like it's more the things that are moving up, like as the cream rises or whatever. And then you have this like, oh, well, here's this sort of master list of, I'm just making up numbers, but like, let's say for LA Film Fest, where we had 12 films in narrative competition, well, then we would have ultimately like 60, 70 films that all of the narrative programmers would need to see. And then we'd argue those out to get to the 10 to 12. And so that you're all coming from a base understanding of like, because you don't want to be in a programming meeting where I'm like, well, no, her movie is wonderful. And you're like, well, no, this one's wonderful, but we haven't seen them each other. Like, we haven't seen the other film. Mm-hmm. You have to have everyone seeing everything so that they can be making the same comparisons. And then it can be a thing of, well, often what I would be arguing about in those is like, I don't think you're understanding their intent. I feel I see their intent more and therefore think it's more successful. Whereas you think that they were trying to do this and fell short. I would argue, no, what they were trying to do, because it's arbitrary. It's absolute like guesswork of what my own vision is telling me, and then how I think an audience will respond, how I think other people, like, again, the many filters. But so you'll have those discussions, or like I said, like with comedies, there's definitely been times that I'm like, you guys are crazy. This is funny. I'm funnier than all of you, so I should count more. Like, I've never laughed at anything you've said.
Right.
So why should you get to vote here? But you become very tied to like the films that you really like. It's like you're part of their filmmaking team. And if they do get programmed, those filmmakers are like, who are you? And you're like, I'm basically one of you. I'm almost a producer. Like, I fought for this. But like a phrase that I used at LA Film Fest all the time was, do you have a knife for this film? Meaning like every film that kind of rises the ranks needs at least one solid champion in that room, because you need someone who, if there's other people, like, because they wax and wane, and there's something that's like, oh yeah, no brainer. And then, I liked it at first, but now I've seen more things. So there's generally the ones that make the list are because someone consistently was like, no, that film is fantastic. That filmmaker has a voice that needs to be heard. And again, like you never know if someone's going to respond. Like, there's nothing you could do other than make the best thing that fits you as an artist.
It's so cool to hear that you guys are like fighting for the filmmakers. Like you like, it's not about necessarily even the festival at that point. It's like, I know it is in general, but you're like, you get attached to a certain project. You get attached to the intention that somebody was trying to bring to a project, and you fight for that shit.
Well, and that's why we're different. We're so different from critics, because I'm not looking. You shouldn't be in programming unless you're looking for the best thing in every film. Like, you need to start every film that you're about to view with the, oh, I hope it's good. Because if you're just hoping it's like crap, so you can like, I watched half of it and it was enough. Like, you're not giving it its fair shake. Like that. And so the people that I work with, they approach it that way of like, please be good, please be good. And then you get psyched, and then you want the films that you're going to champion. And it really is like, because we all have that filter. And sometimes like we will go back to sort of, great, well, what are our mission statements? It's like, it's the economy of means. It's innovative storytelling. Like, what are the filter of this particular festival? Fine. That's like our good divining rod of like, what's going to lead me in the right direction. But truly, like, independent programmer passion for projects is because once it gets into a mix and you're like, all right, we're only talking about narrative competition right now, then I'm going to be like, no, we do not have anything like this. It's like female giallo or whatever. Like, no one else is making this film. We should be showing this film. Yeah.
So when you're watching films all day, and be honest here, is there certain films that you get you get 10 minutes in, 15 minutes in, and you can't continue? Or are you...
Oh, can't continue. First off, the very true reality is I know within 2 minutes if I'm going to like a movie.
That's what I'm asking,
Yeah. I never stop at that point because,
so you watch the whole thing?
I don't watch everything all the way through, but I give everything at least the first act. And a lot of times I'll go to the end just to see, like, is this going to twist something? Like, is it subverting? But if you haven't in the first 30, 40 minutes, like, sold me on your premise, your tone, your
Because that's something very good for filmmakers to know.
Oh,
like,
for sure.
You know what I mean?
And honestly, I think a lot of, and again, because at Sundance it's different because I'm doing episodics, those are shorter, so it's easier. Like, if they're only 20 to 40 minutes, yeah, I'm watching those all the way through. That's easy. But on the feature side, it's that thing of like, if you haven't proved yourself to me in 30 minutes, like, I don't know why you think your third act is going to save you, because we need this whole piece. And even if you're like, oh, but the narrative twists around, I'm like, well, no, because what those 30 minutes also were showing me was like, if you had the fundamentals, like the craft of it. Yeah. So I think and again, because I'm very sensitive and I think all the time, like I think of those rejection letters, like the day the rejection letters go out, like physically pains me. I'm like, oh, my karma. And I have to concentrate on like, oh, I've been able to give the good news. Like I've been able to invite this many filmmakers, and we divvy those up so that different people get the glow of like calling someone or something. But the idea of, oh, so many people's dreams are going to be crushed today, and they gave us this thing, and they paid to have us judge their art.
Yeah.
Like a lot of things that I feel like philosophically opposed to, like, don't let me judge your art, make your art. But that's literally what we have to do. It's like, we're all in this together.
There's an agreement that everybody's going into.
Yeah.
For sure.
But I do recognize it's a leap of faith. Like you're handing and entrusting something with me. So I'm not going to be like, oh, I know in 2 minutes, I'm not an asshole.
Yeah.
I mean, I probably am, but less of one.
Yeah. I also feel like Sundance in specific, I'm assuming Bentonville and LA Film Festival are kind of different in ethos and like, but Sundance specific, it feels like a lot more so on the feature side. It's a lot of like character studies. Like I can't remember the last time that, which are amazing and which is like rich of independent cinema, is mostly these like character studies, whether it's, you know, Honey Boy or like Whiplash or something like. I wonder is that something that you guys communicate about in general? Is that, or is that just because it's like, oh, this is kind of feeling like a Sundance movie?
No, I think it's actually more a reflection of like what the trends are in American indie cinema. I think that a lot of first-time filmmakers are making things that are character-driven because that's what's really interesting to them, or that's the thing it's based on their own life, or they've been ruminating for however long. But if you look at the world cinema section, it's a completely different bag. You'll get so much more that's just atmospheric or whatever. I do think we have a mix of things, but I do think it's a genuine reflection of the kind of percentages of each band of storytelling that we're getting. And so you're seeing more in American indie that's character driven because that's what American indie filmmakers are.
I wonder why
making.
that is, though. Do you know? Or what's your opinion on that?
I wonder, part of it is what I'm sure there's definitely people more educated than me can speak to this, but like a lot of countries have just more national arts funding. And so they'll have like Scandinavian films are gorgeous, and they are like, they're moody and tempered and sort of pastoral, like there's something there. And it's part of, they're giving the funding from their government to be like, spend this. Whereas we're like, okay, well, I have a nice camera for 5 days instead of it's the coverage thing all over again, right? It's, oh no, I'm going to concentrate on verbal storytelling and like a character piece and performance storytelling, because also those are the films that sell. Like something like if I have an actor in it that can do something. So
Yeah, it reminded me of a Danish director. Have you seen Violet? Do you know?
yeah. Oh yeah, yeah.
But I was going to say, in regards to this director, all of his movies are granted, like funded based, like from the government, and they're all extremely weird and beautiful.
Yeah.
And it feels like such a luxurious sort of like way to make movies sometimes.
And those, I mean, there's a budget difference in that. Like if I want to make something really beautiful and sumptuous and outside, like great, what lenses am I getting to do that? Or am I going to like have a busted down Ari from 3 generations ago, which is what I can afford. So, or the like DP that I have has his own gear and that's what we have options to. So it is a budgetary difference. And so it's where are you spending your like time and money? And you're like, well, I want it to look good, but I don't have the funding to make something like beautiful and has like these sweeping landscapes.
So you end up focusing more on the character kind of stuff. I can see how that would work.
And it's not just, Denmark's a good example, but there's a lot of countries that have a lot more funding than we do in terms of art support from an early age. So,
so when you are curating and you're going through films, how do you sort of pace yourself? Like, how do you stack all of your narrative stuff on top of each other, or do you like have to kind of break it up with maybe you do a comedy and then a narrative, and like how do you actually schedule out your day to see those things?
Well, it's different for different festivals. So Sundance has specific teams. So like the doc team is only watching docs. World Cinema is only watching world cinema. So there's less chance to mix it up. If I'm lucky, because I do watch a couple of sections, so I'm primarily watching the episodics, but then I'll look at some features, I'll look at a lot of shorts, and those I will balance out like, okay, I can only do X amount of international in a day because I want to give, and part of it's not just like I like a subtitled film, so I don't have a hang up. I know some people, like, it grates their eyes. Like, it's just a thing. I
only watch with subtitles, even just
I was going to say, I do
films.
have friends that watch English language with subtitles as well. But for me, it's more, it's also even in shorts, the range of budgets is so different that I'm like, if I only watch world shorts for a bit and then I switch to American, I'm like, oh, our poor country, like these sad little, because those are like your lowest budget, right? Like an American narrative short, like those are the ones that have like the smallest budgets most of the time, and it's unfair. Like you can't compare that with someone who's had like this big arts funding. So that's one part of it. But for the festivals, like for LA Film Fest, when that still existed, and certainly for Bentonville, where I do all of the feature programming, so doc and international and American narrative. Like I have to pace out mostly the docs because documentaries make me cry. Like if I'm in a heavy, like, oh, okay, this is the week, I gotta get caught up on the documentary. I cry every day because even the ones that are about something joyful, the grace in them makes me cry. Like the human condition, there's no veneer of fiction. There's no like, oh, people sort of are terrible or not. Like, oh no, the people are terrible, or the world is terrible, or, environment is terrible. So I do like to mix those up. I will absolutely look at what the last film I'm going to watch for the day is ahead of time. Like I'll plan that of either something lighter or something that I think will be good, so I can end on a positive note. Because you need to keep the like well replenished so I can continue to be optimistic when I start again the next day.
Because that's one of my other questions was like, I feel like one film would kind of infer the next film that you watch in some degree. Like, I wonder how you reset before every single movie.
It's interesting because if you watch something that's really good, you're in this great mood because you're like, oh, that was so good. Filmmaking's awesome. Indie filmmakers are the best. And then you start the next one like that. But if it wasn't good, you're like, oh, well, it can only go up.
Sure.
Like it's pretty
I see
easy
what
to
you're saying.
find like an optimistic way in. Like I said, you really do need to want the best for them. But it's also those moments of volume viewing, like when we would get into, like I said, like with LA Film Fest, when we had our short list of like, we all have to watch our 60 narratives and then the 60 docs or whatever. Those are the things where you're like, oh, I'm grinding and I'm trying to pace it out. Like maybe I'll go in the other room and play with my cat for a minute, or like just to do something to break things up. Because the other thing is, no one wants you to complain about your job if your job is you had to watch 4 movies in a day. Like, oh, do you need to watch 4 movies today? Like, I'm not like a factory worker or something, like no part of me is pretending. But there's an emotional weight to it, because you're also, other than the subject matter, like a lot of things have really heavy or dark or just depressing, bleak angles to them. Even if they're well crafted, you're like, cool story of abuse or whatever. And so you need to have a good frame of mind for that. It's an emotional balance of like, I want to be in the right frame for all of these films, and some of these films are going to wallop me emotionally more than others.
I would because you watch so many movies and so much material, I would love to know, and we kind of talked about it before when we were talking about the first act, but I would love your opinion on like where in storytelling do you feel like filmmakers kind of fail a lot of the time?
I think there's a couple things. One, I think that first time, because a lot of what I do is discovery first-time filmmakers. That's like my love of finding people who are like just have a strong voice from the start, even if it's messy, but it's there and it's unique and it's only theirs. But I think even with them, there can be something like, a lot of people, their first work is crafted about or around something that happened to them in real life. And therefore there's plenty in there that I'm like, I'm sure if I asked you, you would explain that this is in here because that's how it happened. And me explaining, but that's not the best film for it. Like there's whole characters or moments or like, I don't know why there's this whole thing in here. So I think it's really learning how to like kill your darlings, like how to look very shrewdly even before you begin. And then the other part of it is, so I sort of nodded to before, but I think a lot of people, and it sounds like I don't want competent filmmaking, because I certainly do. Like I want someone who's firing on all cylinders, but I think a lot of indie film is either derivative or picking up on someone else's voice because they love it as a fan, or like just as someone who loves film. They're like, yes, I'd like to do something in the style of Tarantino, rather than like, no, do it in the style of you. Yeah. Because if it's derivative, then it doesn't feel original. And like what we're looking for is that originality, it's innovation, but it's also a consistency. Like if you're making something that just feels rote, and it's back to the coverage of like, it's competent, they're there, it's getting it done, but it's also could be like a TBS syndicated show. I mean, no discredit to them. Good for all of you making those. But, you want something, if you're making an indie film, hopefully from here, it's just going to be like people throwing money and deals at you. And with money and deals, you have more and more people get to weigh in on what you're making. Indie film is just you. So make something that's just you. Don't try and make something that's reminiscent of something you like.
I would love to know, it's such a stock question, but for someone like yourself, I'm curious. Can you remember a film that you had to fight for the most?
Oh my God. I feel like I fought for so many things, and most of them have been very smug about. I love pointing out when I was like, well, we lost that to Tribeca. Here's a film. Years and years and years ago, I fought for a film called Murder Party, and the director Jeremy Saunier went on to do amazing work and is one of my favorite people and one of my favorite filmmakers. And we had shown his
short... Was it before Blue Ruin?
Oh yeah, it's his first film.
Really?
Yeah. We showed it at Slamdance, and explaining like no, there's vision to this. It's totally different from his other work. And we had shown a short of his previously called Crab Walk, which is also great. And Macon Blair's also in that. But yeah, I remember being like, no, this is great. Trust me when I tell you, like, this is a filmmaker we want to have in the mix. And we did. Now, I literally, like I said, I'm so bad at remember. I should have looked them up.
Okay. Yeah. That's such a good example, though, because I think even going back to what we were saying earlier, Jeremy made Blue Ruin almost by himself, you know, and you watch that and it feels like a Jeremy movie, you know, and then you see him go into like Green Room and it's like, oh, this is even more, you know. There's just on that point, I think that's a great example. Do you have any films that you were maybe fighting against that proved you wrong?
No, because I have impeccable taste. But I will tell you what has proven me wrong. There's been films that I was like not psyched about and thought that, you know, had like actively been championing a different film. It was like, fine. And then at the end of the day, like we always tell the programmers, and I use the same rhetoric with the Spirit Awards committees in terms of determining the nominees of you should hopefully at the end of this process of the films we program, you should love 40% of them, 30% of them. It should be like, oh, best film ever. I did that. This is me. And then another 30%, you should be like, okay, not my thing, but I get it. And then there will be 2 films that you hate and you do not understand why they're there. And that's great because our lineup should be reflective of this committee and this programming team as a group. And if it's just one person's, like, how are you serving a community? How are you gatekeeping if it's just your singular voice? But for me, the films that I'm always like, meh, least psyched about, I haven't been proven wrong with them doing really well, but I have been proven wrong. Often they're the filmmakers I like the best. That I'm like, oh, they're so lovely. I'm really glad we helped them out. I hope they go on and make better things. Those are the ones that I'm like, well, I'm certainly never telling you that I was not your biggest fan. Yeah.
I do want to ask one last thing and then we'll wrap up. But as a person who loves cinema, how do you develop good taste?
Well, I'm sure many people would be like, your taste's terrible, so you don't get to weigh in on this. But I think part of it, it's the outliers thing, right? It's 10,000 hours. Like if you put in the number of films that I've seen, if I hadn't honed some sort of voice, then I don't know what I've been doing for 20 years. Like if you watch this many films for this long and not just watch them passively, but like actively looking for the talent behind the story. Who is this a stepping stone for a larger career? Are they going to do more that I want to see and I want to help them get there? All of that shapes your voice, and all of those conversations, like having something and learning from other programmers who started before you or have really great takes or have a wider breadth of knowledge in areas that you are less like. I'm like, I know Stan Brakhage, but that's kind of the end of my experimental knowledge. So if I'm working with people who can reference things, then you're sort of learning all the time, and you need to be as open to that as anything else. But yeah, I think caring a lot is part of it, and genuinely loving it. Like I'm absolutely repeating myself, but if you don't want to see and be finding things to champion, then you're just smug. Like, good, go be a critic or go be just someone who watches a lot of movies. But if you are looking to be a really strange and particular part of the cog of the indie film machine, programming is a great way to do that.
Well, it was an honor to speak with you today.
Thanks for having me.
For being here, and can't wait to have you back at some point.
Done.
This podcast is a production of Musicbed, the standard of music licensing for film, TV, and advertising. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with another filmmaker you know, and subscribe to be notified for the next episodes.